All right, our recording is going. Good evening, everybody. This is our fourth session on waiting for Jesus, our Advent study, which started well before Advent, but has been pursuing Advent themes. Advent, of course, is a time for waiting for Jesus, and so we emphasize that. We emphasize the prophets, repentance. We emphasize the coming Messiah. And so those are the things that we've studied. So let's see. We've done 3 sessions on Old Testament themes. We did the Day of the Lord and the Messiah and the Peaceable Kingdom. And then now we're moving into New Testament themes. So let me pull up our slideshow here. And as always, feel free to interrupt and ask me questions as we're going. Happy to do that.
This is not related to it, but Amy picked up one of these Advent booklets from the Shoda House.
Oh, yeah.
Over at church. And it's got daily readings in it. So
oh, yeah, those are good. They put out good stuff.
Just thought I'd let everybody know about that.
Do we have those in the church?
Arthex. Free.
Probably do. All right, so here we have our study. We started with the Day of the Lord. Yeah, visions of the prophets. Then we did the Messiah, the Anointed One. Then we did the Peaceable Kingdom. And we focused on this painting by a Quaker artist, Edward Hicks. Fascinating. And then today we are on Jesus' teachings about the apocalypse. So this picture here is of, Jesus was on the Mount of Olives and his disciples looked at the temple and saw how beautiful it was. And Jesus said, not a stone shall be left not thrown down. And so that's kind of the picture that we've got there. And that's Jesus' Olivet Discourse is what that's called. That's where we get most of Jesus' teachings about the end times. But there are a few other places, some parables and some other spots where Jesus does teach us some about what to expect. So let's start by talking about the word apocalypse. You have probably heard this word before. And in what context have you heard the word apocalypse? What does it usually mean?
The last book of the Bible.
Yes, the Revelation of John. What else?
The world ending as we know it.
Yeah.
Sometimes connected to zombies, sometimes connected to a nuclear holocaust, sometimes connected to other things that could change the world as it.
End everything. It's like no life will remain. Everything will be destroyed.
Yeah, usually a very fearsome sort of thing, right? But originally the word apocalypse in Greek, apo means away from, and calypso means secret or something with a lid on it, something that's covered. So the word apocalypse means to take the lid off of it, to uncover, to reveal, or to blow the lid off something. And that's really what the Bible is. It talks about the end of time. It's not trying to scare us, or it's not trying to make us worry that everything will fall apart or the world is changing, although it does talk about those things. But the whole point of the Bible trying to tell us about these things is that it wants to take the lid off. It wants to blow the lid off of what's really going on in the world, how God is really in control. He's in charge, and he hasn't fallen off of his throne, hasn't stopped ruling the world. It wants to uncover what will happen in the future. And so a lot of times we get really fascinated with the details of what will come in the future, and especially when we talk about this Olivet Discourse of Jesus. People are looking for the signs. Have you ever heard someone look for the signs of the end times?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, really. Some people even make it their life's work to try to what all the signs are in the Bible and try to plug in current history into those signs and make sure that see if they can figure out exactly when the world is going to end. my mother had an uncle who was really obsessed with this, and he was convinced that Christ was going to come back. I think it was in like 1981, and he died in 1981. So for him, that's what happened. Um, but there was a book, 84 Reasons Why Christ is going to Come Back in 1984. And then that didn't happen. So the same author wrote 85 Reasons Why Christ is going to Come Back in 1985. But again, that's not what the Bible is doing when it goes into its apocalyptic mode, right? It's trying to uncover, it's trying to show us something behind the scenes of what the world is really like and who God is and who we are, right? The word apocalypse was first used in biblical studies to refer to, just like Mike said, the revelation of John. We'll zoom in here on this icon. This is great. Oh, come on. There it is. The great icon of, there's John down there at the bottom having his vision. And there's his vision of Christ on the throne, holding the keys of death and hell, the sword coming from his mouth, 7 candlesticks, all these details that come from Revelation.
For some reason, that looks like it's more from India.
Yeah, I think this comes from, this looks like, it might come from the Middle East rather than from like European icon artists. Icon writers, I should say. I don't like to be called artists. This is just pictures. Wow, I didn't notice. Look at these little
the candles are
These little-
remind me of
little
the
things
Moorish
on the
designs.
yes.
Hours.
We've got the angels of the 7 churches here. Each one has a church in its hand. So we'll get to more of that when we talk about Revelation. There were other apocalypses at this time. Interestingly enough, the 200 years before and after Jesus were full of literature. Like Jewish people especially were writing a lot of literature. And of course, they had to write it on parchment. Oh man, I just purchased some parchment. Part of a hobby I have that relates to medieval manuscripts, but I just purchased some parchment. It came in the mail the other day and I left it upstairs. But parchment is made out of animal skin, and it usually is just sort of soft and pliable, just like paper. Oh, we got Jack coming in. And so most of these scrolls were written on parchment or papyrus, and then you'd write a full page, and then you'd sew another page on there and write another page, and then sew another page on and write the next one, and then roll them all up into scrolls. And most of the books were written that way. People didn't start writing in this kind of book until about the 300s AD. So all of the early apocalypses were in scrolls. And some of them have survived. Most of them obviously have not, but some of them have. So we've got like the Dead Sea Scrolls, the finds at Nag Hammadi in Egypt. The Apocrypha, we still have copies of that. That's still in some of our Bibles. We read sometimes from the Apocrypha on Sundays. Daniel has a little bit of an apocalyptic section. Fourth Esdras, which is in the Apocrypha, has a large section, and then the books of Enoch are very apocryphal, or apocalyptic, I should say. So there are lots of 1st or 2nd century before Jesus sources for apocalypses. And normally they fall into 2 types. You've got one where a guy goes on a journey to heaven, and an angel will sort of explain what things are going on in heaven and what they mean. The revelation to John sort of fits that mold, although he's having a vision, but it's sort of a vision journey. And then the other type is the historical kind, which is what Daniel does. Daniel sees visions of what will happen in the future, and this king will come after this king, will come after this king, et cetera, et cetera. And most of the apocalypses from these 300 or 400 years fit one or other of these categories, as far as we can tell. Um, except Jesus. Jesus kind of breaks the mold. Leave it to Jesus to break the mold. He always is a little bit different. And even though his teachings have some similar themes and ideas as these other apocalypses, it doesn't. What we're going to read today we're going to read from Matthew, but it's basically the same in Luke and in Mark. He's not going on a journey to heaven, and he's not laying out some sequence of kingdoms in Earth's history. He's not doing either of these things. What Jesus says is utterly unique. It's very different from everything else. And only Jesus in all of these apocalypses has the whole story center around himself. Everyone else is watching something happen to someone else, or God is doing something, but they don't see themselves as the one who's active to make the story happen. Jesus is very clear that it's him, he, the Son of Man, who is coming to make all these things happen. So these are two ways in which Jesus, what we're going to read today, Jesus' teachings are really very, very different from everything else that was going on at the time. So let's look at Matthew chapter 24. Matthew chapter 24. If you have your Bible, let's turn there now. I'm looking at an NIV version, but any version will do, of course. And they're all roughly the same. I mean, these particular verses have been micro scrutinized over the years to find all the little shades of meaning that maybe could give us a hint of when the times will come. Right? So sometimes little translator decisions make a difference, but mostly these versions will all be pretty much the same. So if you've got Matthew 24, would someone please read the first two verses? It can be anybody.
All right, I'll do it.
Thank you.
As Jesus came out of the temple and was going away, his disciples came to point out to him the buildings of the temple. Then he asked them, "You see all these, do you not? Truly I tell you, not one stone will be left here upon another. All will be thrown down."
So if you were one of these disciples and you had just been to Jerusalem, which for us would be like visiting Washington, D.C. or New York City or something, you've seen all the sights. And marveling at how beautiful and glorious these things were. And Herod's temple was glorious. King Herod had built one of the most beautiful temples in the ancient world. How would you feel if while you're walking out of town, Jesus says, "Yeah, it's all going to get destroyed. Just wiped down to the ground"? How would you feel if you had heard this yourself?
Oh,
I need to be with this guy so I can stay safe.
Yeah, that's a great question. How do I stay safe if this happens? Yeah. What else?
everything that I've known all my life is not going to be the same anymore.
It would make you feel disoriented, or like everything you thought was solid might shift. Yeah. And that's
And my
we don't like
comfort
that.
level's been removed.
Yeah. Typically, human beings, we don't like to feel that way. We like to feel like our world is solid and unchanging. And here Jesus is saying, and he makes it so complete, right? Not one stone will be left upon another. Everyone will be thrown down. And in fact, I was just reading today about this temple that Jesus was looking at when he said this. And of course, the Dome of the Rock stands there now. It's a Muslim mosque. And scholars are still not quite sure where this temple stood, whether it stood on the site, precisely the site of the Dome of the Rock, or a little bit to the north, or a little bit to the south, or even outside of the temple complex, just even further to the south. They are not sure where this temple stood exactly. There's a consensus that most scholars think it was the same place as the Dome of the Rock. the Romans really did destroy this area so completely that it's impossible without doing archaeological things. And of course, because it's a holy site, no one's going to do any archaeological digs there anytime soon. So Jesus' prophecy did come true. It was completely razed. And the Romans built a temple to Jupiter on the same site. And because they completely wanted to destroy any hint that God was worshipped there. So, and this all happened within, so let's see, this is probably about 30 AD. This happened in 70 AD. So it was within the lifetime of the people who were listening to Jesus that this happened. And he knew, I mean, he could foretell being the Son of God. He knew that there was something that big coming down the pike that they would live to see. And imagine trying to be Jesus. How would you feel trying to communicate to these disciples something so big that they couldn't even imagine? Like imagine if you could go back 1 year and try to explain to yourself from, early December in 2019 exactly how life would change through 2020. That would be really hard.
Yeah.
There's just some things you can't tell until you live through it, right? And Jesus, I think he's got that same kind of thing going on. Like he knows what's going to happen. And he's like, how do I explain this to them? What's important about all this for them to know? And so the disciples, of course, are interested in this because who's not interested in the end of the world, right? We all have kind of a morbid fascination with watching things fall apart. I mean, we hate it. It feels terrible. And we don't like to be in it, but sometimes you just can't stop watching it even. Sometimes we get hooked on the news, right? Or the 24-hour news cycle or websites that are always updated and always wanting to know what's going on, and they felt the same way. So somebody pick up for us in verse 3 and read just that one verse, verse 3.
They will deceive.
As Jesus was sitting on Mount Olives.
I think I've got one of these weird Bibles.
Oh, we're in chapter 24, verse 3.
I know, but it's very strange the way they've changed the wording.
Some Bibles change up the versification a little bit. I'll read it. As Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately. Tell us, they said, when will this happen? And what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? So this is not just one question. This is 3 questions. First, the time question, when? Second, what's the sign of your coming? And what's the sign of the end of the age? And what they've done here, they don't know it. Jesus knows it, but they don't. They've mixed up 2 different events in their thinking. They're mixing up the thing that Jesus was talking about, the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, and the end of time. Jesus knows these are 2 different events. We know, looking back on it from 2,000 years later, we know they're separate events because one of them happened and one of them hasn't happened yet. But the disciples were not able to disentangle those 2 events. They thought it would obviously all be one because they couldn't imagine Jerusalem being destroyed and it not being the end of the world. So Jesus has to start this out by disentangling some of their ideas. And it's useful for us too, because we get our ideas of things intertangled as well. If there were a nuclear war and one of the bombs fell on St. Louis and like in America and government ceased to function or something like that, we might tend to think of that as the end of the world. When Rome was sacked, they thought it was the end of the world. When When the Black Plague came through Europe, they thought it was the end of the world, right? I mean, all of these things have made people think it's the end of the world because we have a hard time untangling our own disasters. So Jesus has to start out, and these first 14 verses, I think, are completely about disentangling our ideas of disaster and then the end of time. Let's see how Jesus does it. He starts out by not answering their questions. Jesus does this all the time in the Gospels. He starts out by not answering the question. His first answer is, watch out. Verse 4, watch out that no one deceives you. So the very first thing that he says, the thing that's most important for them to know is to be careful. That there are people trying to deceive you. That there is a devil, right? And he is out there trying to make us think things that aren't true. And particularly, this is almost an assault on faith, right? Watch out that no one deceives you about these things. The first thing we're supposed to be is, the first word is watch, or be careful, or be wary. So whenever you approach these topics, Jesus is saying, let's be careful, let's be wary, let's be clear about what we mean and what we don't mean. Watch out that no one deceives you, for many will come in my name claiming I am the Christ. And will deceive many. They will be successful. Even Christians will be pulled away by these false anointed ones, false messiahs. So right away, we've got people we have to watch out for. We've got ideas we have to watch out for. We need to make sure we know what is true. He says, you will hear of wars and rumors of wars, but see to it that you are not alarmed. What? What? There are wars and rumors of wars, but don't be alarmed. Such things, he says, must happen. At the end of the In other words, the world is a screwed up place. He says. It's full of sin. It's full of people who do terrible things. And you'll hear about
Background.
and the terrible things are going to keep going, right, until the end. But just because something terrible happens to you doesn't mean it's the end of time. That's what he's saying. So there. Wait, go ahead. Yeah, so he's disentangling our ideas of our disaster versus the end of the world. Where are we here? All right. So yeah, disentangling. I'm sorry to get distracted there.
I'm sorry. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Oh,
right. How's the bathroom?
my internet is going in and out. That's why I have my video off.
Oh, that's fine. Did you have a question or comment? Did we miss anything?
Part back noise. Okay.
All right, we can just mute you until you need to talk.
I missed the link because if you could repeat that. I sent.
Oh, sure. So Jesus is
Freezing my head.
disentangling our ideas of disaster from the end times. Just because
Okay.
it's a disaster doesn't mean it's the end of time. You'll hear of wars and rumors of wars. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. He keeps going. Nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places. Right? So the world is a screwed up place, and it's a dangerous place, and it will keep being a dangerous place. But it doesn't mean the end is coming yet. And I think since we're looking at this 2,000 years later, I think we have a unique perspective on this that Jesus' disciples didn't have. Because we've seen these things. We've seen the world's ups and downs. And if you know anything about the history of the world, you know there have been some terrible, terrible times, sometimes for specific people, sometimes for a lot of people. And there have been good times also, right? Ups and downs, and the end has not come yet. And so we have this perspective that his disciples didn't have, that we can kind of see what Jesus meant by this. But then we can project this into our future as well, right? No matter how bad things get in our neck of the woods, it doesn't necessarily mean it's the end of time. Jesus even says these are just the beginning of birth pangs, just a small part of what is possible in terms of suffering and difficulty. So the first thing he wants us to do is be careful. Don't be deceived. Don't think that it's happening just because things are terrible. Right? The next thing he wants us to know is that we will be handed over to persecution and put to death. And you'll be hated by all nations because of me. And you've heard me talk about this before, but the persecution of Christians right now in the world is greater than it's ever been, even all the way back to the Roman Empire and so on. Christians all around the world are still being persecuted and handed over to governments and put to death just for being Christians. And it doesn't mean it's the end of time again, Jesus is saying, right? These persecutions are going to happen. It doesn't mean everything's over yet. But he does say many will turn away from the faith and will betray and hate each other. And there were many false prophets will appear. Here that's the second time they've showed up. And will deceive many people. Because of the increase of wickedness, the love of most people will grow cold. Fascinating statement that most people's love will grow cold because of the increase of wickedness. But verse 13 has the one thing that we're supposed to do. He who endures, he who stands firm to the end will be saved. So the first thing Jesus has told us is let's disentangle our ideas. The second thing he's saying is endure, right? Things are going to get hard, and they'll get harder and harder along the way. But endure, stand firm through these things, and salvation will come. So he's managing expectations. Have you ever walked in to have a conversation with your boss and realized you kind of need to manage his expectations or her expectations of what things might be? Jesus is kind of doing the same thing. He's managing expectations. He's framing his teaching with these things that are not quite an answer to the question he was asked. Because he wants them to know that they need to be careful. They need to know what's true. They need to be ready to endure. And they need to not be afraid or worried as they're going through all this. And that's his word also then to us, right? That we need to endure, that we need not be afraid, that we need to be careful and know what's true and what's false. Because this is how we persevere. And then finally in verse 14, he finally gets to a sign. The thing that they asked for at the very beginning. What will be the sign of your coming? He finally gets to a sign. It's something that you can hang your hat on. And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached to the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. So this is missionary success. This is the success of the mission movement. The gospel of the kingdom will be preached to the whole world. For a long time, the gospel was just sort of holed up there in the Middle East. And then it kind of moved up into Europe, although there were Christians throughout the world at that time too. And then it spread even through like Western colonization. As terrible as colonization ended up being, it also sort of helped spread the gospel to all around the world. And now there are Christians in every part of the world, just like Jesus prophesied there would be. There'll be a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. I've got people who I went to school with at Oral Roberts University who think that they can bring about the end of time by translating the Bible into every known language. And so they're busy about translating the Bible, which is a great thing to do. Whether that means they're bringing on the end of time or not is a whole other question. It'll come when it comes. Only God knows when. But yeah, they take this verse very literally. So all that is what I call disentangling, right? Making sure that he's framing this teaching properly so that we know not to be afraid of every little thing. And then he goes on now and talks about things that have directly to do with, I think, the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. And again, this is within the lifetime of his hearers. Many of his disciples lived past this, through this, and past it. And what happened was there was a rebellion against Rome in Judea. The Jews were successful at fighting off the Roman legions for about a year and a half. But then Rome gathered more legions and came and attacked under Titus, who would later be emperor. And I think it was Titus. Don't quote me on that. But they besieged Jerusalem for over a year. And it was a really terrible siege. I mean, sieges are bad all the time, but this one was one of the worst. And the Jewish people had two parties, two political parties, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and they were always arguing with each other. And they, even with the Romans besieging their city, they still argued with each other. There were over 1 million people in the city before the siege started. And I think there were something like 50,000 left when the siege ended. Over 1 million people died in that siege. And most of it was because of starvation. Because even though they had food supplies in the city, they couldn't stop their political arguing long enough to work together. And so one of the parties, I think it was the radical Pharisees, I think they ended up burning the food supply because it was a bid to gain political power in some way. Like, oh, come on, guys. You can't put your two-party system aside to fight the Romans at the gates. No, they couldn't. So, yeah, it was a pretty terrible time. Right? A year-long siege, 1 million people dead. The Romans were victorious and they came in and destroyed everything. And Jesus knows this is coming. So this is what these next verses have to do. Would someone else like to read verses 15 through 20?
I can.
Thank you.
It says, therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, whoever reads, let him understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let him who is on the housetop not go down to take anything out of his house. And let him who is in the field not go back to get his clothes. But woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days. And pray that your flight may not be in winter or on the Sabbath.
Yeah. So he's telling them to run away. Not a very patriotic message, we might say. The thing at the very beginning, when you see the holy, standing in the holy place, the abomination that causes desolation. In Luke, what he says is when you see armies of the Gentiles surrounding Jerusalem. So I'm not sure which of those would have been the thing that he said originally. The prophecy of Daniel had to do with a Gentile ruler standing in the temple of God and claiming to be God or to be higher than God or something like that. And that happened in the time of the Greek occupation, and also happened again with this destruction of Jerusalem. Has anyone ever been to Rome? Any of you guys been to Rome? Ever visit Rome? I was blessed to be able to go 4 or 5 years ago, and there's an arch just next to the Colosseum, the Arch of Titus. And there's a famous stone cut relief of Roman soldiers carrying away the treasures of the Jewish temple. And the arch was made in celebration of this victory of the Romans over the Jews. It was a terrible, terrible time. Here's a description from Josephus, a historian at the time. He says, "No pity was shown on account of age or out of respect for anyone's dignity. Children and elderly, lay people and priests alike were slain. The battle surged ahead and surrounded everybody, including both those who begged for mercy and those who resisted. The flames spread out to a great distance, and its noise mixed with the groans of the perishing. And such was the height of the ridge and of the magnitude of the burning that one would have imagined the whole city was aflame." That was from Josephus' book on the Jewish wars. So everybody, almost everybody there died. And the Christians didn't, though. Interestingly enough, the Christians remembered what Jesus had prophesied. They remembered this very prophecy, that when you see this coming, then flee. Don't wait to go down to your house to get your cloak. Don't wait, to go down and get anything. Just go, get out of there, right? They remembered this prophecy when this was coming. And so when all the other refugees of Judea were coming into the city of Jerusalem to be protected, the Christians left. They left and they went to the city of Petra in the Nabatean country, which is just over the border to the east. So the Christians left. They remembered Jesus saying. And so that was part of the bad blood between Jews and Christians that has continued even through the Middle Ages and into the current period. Part of it was that the Jews hated the Christians for leaving and surviving. And the Christians left because of what Jesus had said. So this ends up being an effective prophecy, and it's one that comes true. And you can point to a time in history just 40 years later that it was needed and necessary and fulfilled. And so that kind of answers one of the disciples' first questions, right? When will this happen? And what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? First he disentangled, then he gives them a little information about this siege of Jerusalem, which is exactly what someone said. How am I going to keep myself safe when this happens? Well, he's giving them the answer. When you see this and this happening, flee, get out of there. But then he goes on. And in verses 21 through 24, then we've got some intensification, even beyond the suffering of the destruction of Jerusalem. For then there will be great distress, unequaled from the beginning of the world until now, and never to be equaled again. If those days had not been cut short, no one would survive. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be shortened. At that time, if anyone says to you, "Look, here is the Christ," or "There he is," do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will appear and perform great signs and miracles to deceive even the elect, if that were possible. See, I have told you ahead of time. So he's prophesying an intensification of trouble, of tribulation, but also of the attack on faith, the false messiahs, the deception, the attempt to deceive. These things are intensifying. And he goes on then in verse 27. Now he's going to describe the very moment when the Son of Man returns. And this is kind of answering their third question: what will be the end of the age? For as lightning that comes from the east is visible even in the west, so will the coming of the Son of Man be. So quick, immediate, but also unmistakable, unmissable, right? Wherever there's a carcass, there the vultures will gather. Immediately after the distress of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from the sky, and the heavenly bodies will be shaken. That is a quote from one of the prophets we already read. This is from Joel, I believe. Isaiah mentioned some of these things. So he's pointing back to the day of the Lord, a tradition that we've already talked about, that there will be a great and terrible day of the Lord. At that time, the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky. He doesn't say what that sign is, but some sort of sign or signal will appear in the sky, and all the nations of the earth will mourn. They will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory. And he will send his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of the heavens to the other. That's definitely not 70 AD. That's definitely not the destruction of the temple. Nothing like that has happened yet. Right? This is the end of time. This is direct information about what we can expect when the world ends. And it's quick, like lightning. It connects with the Old Testament things we've already studied, the Messiah, the peaceable kingdom, and then, of course, the day of the Lord. Jesus is particularly pointing out signs in the heavens. They may have been more aware of the heavens back then because of looking to the stars to try to describe, to see what was going on in the world. We don't do that quite so much, except with astrology and horoscopes and those kind of things, but that's not what he's talking about here. But he doesn't give us any more details about what the sign will be. And then right after that comes the Son of Man on the clouds. So this isn't some long, like 7-year sequence of certain events and signs. Sometimes Christians will do this. We'll take what's in Revelation and what's in Daniel and what's here, and we'll try to mishmash them all together and come up with a specific sequence of historical events that will lead to the end of time. Not what Jesus is talking about here. He's talking about signs that come and then immediately the Son of Man in the clouds, right? It happens quickly. And all the elect are gathered together. And this short paragraph is really all that we get then about the end of time, the specific details about what will happen. And then he goes on and gives us more framing, right? So we've had the disentangling at the beginning, and now here's the bookend on the other side, sort of a postlude about how the day and the hour are unknown, right? And how his words will not pass away. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. He says, no one knows that day or hour, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. As it was in the days of Noah, so will it be at the coming of the Son of Man. For in the days before the flood, people were eating and drinking and marrying and giving in marriage, blah, 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 daily life, right? Going to work, going to school, right? All the things that we do every day, up to the day that Noah entered the ark. And they knew nothing about what would happen until the flood came and took them all away. And he says that's how it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. People will be going about their business. For some people, it will seem like a normal day. I mean, some people will be experiencing increased persecution and trouble. We already read about that. Intensification of the attack on faith. But for other people, it's just going to seem like a normal day. Get up, go to school, go to work, eat your breakfast, drink your coffee, right? And knowing nothing about what will happen until there's the sign in the sky and here comes the Son of Man. 2 men will be in the field. One will be taken and the other left. 2 men will be grinding with a hand mill. One will be taken and the other left. That verse is often misinterpreted. Usually we think of it as the good person gets taken up into heaven and the other one gets left behind. But actually this, in the context of Noah and the flood washing people away, what it means is that one will be seized and washed away, like with the flood, while the other is left behind safe. One of the women will be taken away, seized and washed away, and the good one will be left behind safe. Right? So in these verses, it's actually good to be left behind and it's bad to be taken. We often get that switched around. Therefore, keep watch, he says, because you do not know on what day or hour your Lord will come. And he gives us several metaphors, the metaphor of the thief, the householder, the metaphor of a servant who's been told to watch out and has been given a job to do, and then the master comes back and finds him. If he finds him doing his job, then he gets rewarded. If he finds him not doing his job and oppressing other people, then there's punishment. So that's the main chunk of the Olivet Discourse. That's the main teaching that Jesus gives about the end of time. He frames it very carefully. He answers their question about Jerusalem. Then he gives us some very specific details, but just a few, not too many, about what to expect. What are your thoughts on this? What have you heard before? What other questions need to be answered after this? What do you think? What do you think from what we've seen so far?
I thought it was interesting that what's usually used as a basis for the rapture is the exact opposite.
Right. When we read our own ideas into it, it don't really seems to make sense sometimes, but you got to read what's there into our own ideas.
Mhm.
Yeah, he doesn't really mention a rapture. We'll talk about the rapture next time when we talk about Paul's teachings and what he means by that. But yeah, Jesus doesn't really mention that. You could say that the trump, the angels gathering the elect in verse 31 could be interpreted as a rapture. It's difficult to tell here whether Jesus means it that way or whether it's what we'll talk about next, which is the separating of the sheep from the goats, the good from the bad. Any other thoughts on these things before we go on? Let's go on and look at Jesus' parables, because he doesn't just stop with this direct teaching. He goes on to talk, he gives us several parables. What's it going to be like? And Jesus is constantly doing this anyway in his teachings. He's a really good teacher that way. So he gives us 3 parables about what the end of the world will be like. And so what you have to ask when you're looking at these parables is this a likeness? Is this the kingdom of heaven is like this thing? Or is he giving us direct information? Here's what's going to happen. Right? So far, we've had direct information. The Son of Man will come in the clouds with glory, give his angels the trumpet, and so on and so forth. Now he's going to start giving us metaphors. And so when you're dealing with metaphors, you can't always take it too literally because it's a metaphor. And so you've got to be careful about what aspects that we take from this to apply to our understanding of the end times. Jesus talks about the 10 virgins. We did this on a Sunday recently. And the whole point of that one is readiness, right? Be ready, have the oil that you need, because 5 of the virgins have the oil and 5 of them don't. And the ones that are ready get rewarded. But here again, we have the idea of suddenness, that he comes back suddenly when people aren't expecting it. And some people are ready and some people are not. Right? So that's kind of the key to this particular story. The next one is very similar, the parable of the talents. He's telling his disciples, look, you've been given gifts, you've been given talents, and there will be a day of reckoning. And just like in verse 45 through 51, where he talks about the servant who wants to be found doing this job, same thing with the parable of the talents. You want to be found doing your job, having successfully, fulfilled your mission from God, and not having just hidden your talent in the ground. And then we have this story of the sheep and the goats. And we'll spend some more extra time on this. Here, Jesus, he gets away from the parables. I almost don't want to call this a parable because he goes back into direct information mode. When the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, we already had that in the last chapter, right? You know this detail. This is familiar. He will sit on his throne in the heavenly glory. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate the people one from another as a shepherd. Here's the metaphorical part. As a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He will put the sheep on his right and the goats on his left. And that's where the metaphor ends. None of the rest of this is about sheep. There are no more verses here about sheep and goats. The rest of this is all about the righteous and the unrighteous. Right? So we've actually got just one verse or two verses of metaphor, and the rest of this is really more sort of direct information. The king will say to those on his right, "Come, you are blessed of my Father." Look how he describes this. First, he says, "Come." So this is proximity, right? The people who are righteous here, the sheep, as it were, they get to be close to God. "Come, you who are blessed by my Father." They get to inherit the kingdom. This is family language. Right? You're part of the family. You are the privileged part of the family. You get to inherit the wealth and the power and the goodness of your Father. Right? Inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the beginning, from the foundation of the world. Jesus is saying here that this good end has been prepared for God's people from the beginning, that it's already ready. It's already prepared. So God isn't waiting on the end of time for him to get all the decoration done in heaven or something like that. It's ready. It's good to go, right? It's been prepared for us from the beginning of time, from the creation of the world, the foundation of the world, some translations say. And it's been prepared for us. This is our purpose, our telos in Greek, our perfection. What God intends for us is to inherit this kingdom. Something where we fit perfectly and it fits perfectly around us. Right? For I was hungry and you gave me something to eat, thirsty and you gave me something to drink. You know the rest of the story. It's interesting that the righteous don't know when they did all this. So they're like, what? When did we ever do these things to you? And you know his reply, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers of mine, you did for me. It's a wonderful story if it stops there, but it doesn't, because we got to deal with the goats on the left side now. And he says to those on his left, depart. That's the opposite of come, right? This is depart away from God. People are separated from God. Who are cursed into the eternal fire. Instead of the kingdom, eternal fire. And this eternal fire is not for them. This is not a place that this is the place that has been prepared for that is angels, right? So yeah, so God has not planned and prepared. He doesn't want for people to go to this place. This place is for the devil and his angels. And yet some people end up going there. You who are cursed into the eternal fire, prepared for the devil and his angels. And it's not prepared for the devil and his angels to rule there, right? You get the sense that this is a prison for them, not a place where they like run around or are in charge of anything. For I was hungry and you gave me nothing to eat, etc., etc. And then they too don't know, like, Lord, we thought we did all. We thought we did everything we needed to. When did we ever see you hungry and not give you help, or thirsty and not give you drink? Right? And he says, whenever you did it not for one of the least of these, you did it not for me. And they will go away into eternal punishment, but the righteous to eternal life. So this is a difficult passage for us in some ways. Some ways it's perfect, right? We know the good get what's coming to them and the bad get what's coming to them, and that's kind of nice. But we usually have a hard time with everlasting fire and everlasting punishment. We don't like to think about God that way. And it's interesting that this is not a very Protestant-friendly parable here, because it doesn't have to do with faith. Jesus doesn't say, come into my kingdom, for I preached and you believed. It's all about works. I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me drink. I don't know what Martin Luther thought about this passage. It would be interesting to hear what he has to say about it. But the Protestant doctrine is typically that what matters is whether you believe in Jesus, and that is in the Bible, right? That's part of what the Bible teaches, but It's only part. The rest of it is you have to work out what you believe, right? Like James, the book of James says, show me your faith by your works. And that's what Jesus is doing here. He's saying, like, you guys showed me your faith by the way you treated other people. And you guys showed me by the way you treated that you don't have any faith, that you don't believe in me, and you showed me that you did. Any comments about that before we move on?
That's a good point. I mean, we hear about that all the time. You know, it's like, is it works or is it just belief? And so
Right.
it's apparently both.
Yeah.
Okay.
You're right. You really just can't come down on one side or the other of that because the Bible comes down on both. So that's where we are on Jesus' teachings. We'll go next week into Paul's teachings, and we'll talk more specifically about the rapture from 1st and 2nd Thessalonians and Antichrist and some of these other ideas. And then finally, we'll get in our last session to the Revelation to John and give sort of a quick overview of what's going on there. Any thoughts or comments before we wind up for the night? Anything jump out at you as strange or unusual that you hadn't thought of before?
It's all strange and unusual because I've never read it before.
The thing about being surprised, you know, on both sides, is kind of interesting.
Yeah,
But the good being surprised, the bad being surprised.
it's such a strange part of that, but yeah, they are. It makes me wonder, like, which thing where's my blind spot, right? Is my blind spot the place where I don't do what I should do? Or is my blind spot the place where I'm already doing what I'm supposed to be doing?
You said that, I guess it does kind of keep you on your toes.
Well said.
Well, I thank you very much. I have to go and get a call from my grandbaby.
Excellent. Well, I will stop our recording.
Thank you.